Today we're going to start with discretion, piety, prudence, and charity. So a couple weeks ago we talked about Christian getting up the mountain. As he got up the mountain, it's starting to get dark. As it's dark, it makes it harder for him to see. He's getting a little bit nervous. He starts approaching this big palace. This palace was beautiful, which is good because the palace itself could be seen at night. So remember, that was one of his problems, was it was nighttime. He didn't know what was in front of him. He saw the lions, but he couldn't really ascertain their danger because it was dark. His screw up in the arbor really set him up for trouble later on. But at the same time, in spite of the difficulty and the trials, the palace still stands in front of him, gleaming enough even in the nighttime to give him a target to walk towards, encouragement to walk towards. So even though there's these lions that he's afraid of, the palace is still such that he desires to go into it. There's something that drives him towards the palace. Now, if you remember, when we talked about the palace, is that it's actually a picture of the local church. What is it that the new believer needs? Well, they need the local church. They need a good biblical church. And Bunyan views that as the palace beautiful. And we'll talk more about that tonight and today. And then we'll also talk more about that next week as we actually get into the palace. But as he comes up, he has to make it past the lions. The first person he meets as he gets past the lions is the porter. And the porter, whose name is Watchful, asks him a series of questions. Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you late? And the big thing that within that conversation, the big thing we want to understand is that there was an expectation. Watchful wasn't just asking questions for information purposes. He had expectations that he wanted to see Christian meet. Now remember, these aren't necessarily his expectations in the sense of, well, I want you to be 6 feet and you have to have a minimum income of whatever. He's not interviewing him for an apartment. He's asking him questions like, why are you late? Why aren't you at a certain maturity level? We know that you had problems, but what have you done about them? How have you handled them? How have you dealt with this? And the expectation was that God wants us to be holy. Therefore, it's not wrong for us to believe that everybody that comes into this church that's a professing believer should value and try to live up to a certain level of holiness. Now, what that looks like is a little bit more complicated, right? And where we fail has to be covered with grace. So it's not necessarily saying we're looking for perfection, but what we are looking for is, what are you striving towards? And so now Watchful says, I've heard enough from your testimony that it sounds like you're a Christian. Let me bring in a few more people. So already we're starting to get that lesson, that Watchful doesn't just say, okay, yes, you're good, I'm happy with you. He knows his weaknesses. He knows that he looks at a couple things, but if he brings in a few more people, then they're going to get a better view of who this new person is. I was trying to do that. Did I do it right? I don't remember.
I recognize that.
Thanks. Right. So Watchful doesn't just view it as, I'm going to handle this myself. Right? He looks at this as, I need help. So he brings in more people. Now, this kind of brings up an interesting question. Why is he doing this? This guy's interested in joining the local church. Now, this is in Bunyan's view, this wouldn't be just visiting the local church. This is actually joining the local church. This is where you are now part of the local body. You are considered to be a church member in this little nonconformist biblical church. Now, why do they care so much to go through all this effort to see if they'll even let Christian in? What would you guys think about that? Why is Bunyan kind of hammering on this?
Wolves among the sheep.
One question is certainly, we don't want wolves, right? We don't want to mess up the flock. What else? I mean, the first century church, why would they do this? In the first century church, you could be outside of the body for a year before they let you come into a church meeting. There were no visitors to church meetings in the first century church. Why would they do that? Persecution. What was the fear? Spies. Right? If they let you come in, you knew everything about them. You could identify each member of the church, and then you were open to persecution. So it used to be that you'd actually go through it almost, in some places, a year-long catechism, ending with baptism, and then you were welcomed into the fellowship to be able to share in communion. That was their process. Not because that was what was biblically mandated, but that was what they did to protect themselves from the persecution that would be happening. That was the early church. That all changed when Constantine took power and so on, but nonetheless, they had a certain process for it. Now, what was happening here in Bunyan's time? Now he's talking about a nonconformist church in an Anglican world. Actually, kind of something similar.
I was going to say, they had something similar because even Bunyan was so angelic, isn't it?
Exactly, because there are certain things that were allowed and not allowed by the Anglican Church. So who you let in could mean a lot of things. Now, we don't struggle with this, so therefore, do we just chuck this whole thing out the door? That's your question. Was Bunyan so short-sighted that he's only looking at his little worldview and saying nothing else?
Well, even in a church culture that welcomes visitors and, you're wanting to make it easy for people to integrate into the church, there's still a minimum that believe in Christ and you're not Satan worshiper or following some other religion and thinking that we can just all kind of worship together.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you're going to minister to the people that come, you've got to know something about where they're at to know what they need to grow spiritually.
Right. So how do you ascertain where this person is? On one hand, to be able to help them grow, and then on the other hand, to protect the flock. So there's kind of there's a balance to this. So if we look at this, it's not, like JD said, there's a little bit of a minimum, and this is what Watchful is looking for. There's a minimum expectation that if you're a professing believer, that you're attaining, you're not only seeking, but you're also attaining some level of holiness. There's a desire within you that you're actually trying to do this. And now the way that you go about this is observation, but obviously we're not going to sit there and say, just wait on the doorstep while we watch your life for a few years, right? Instead, we ask questions, and you're going to find that the questions that are going to be asked are pretty specific, and they're complicated. They're challenging. And so this will be what we're going to learn in this lesson, is how does Bunyan view the members of the church essentially interviewing a new member, okay? But the goal is really simple. Even in our day and age, we have to ask the question of what does it mean that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? What does that statement mean? It's used in Galatians. Jesus uses it in the gospel. What does that mean?
Well, just like yeast, it expands quickly.
Right.
So even if you have just one person who has very off views, mingling with people who may not be as discerning, it's just going to spread to them.
Exactly. So it's exactly. It's once you get a little bit of bad doctrine or a bad practice, the chances that expands increases dramatically if that person is involved and active in the local body. Does that make sense? Because what they view.
Given approval by that body.
Exactly. Once they're in, you're basically saying you're one of us, so therefore you're welcome to say, think, and feel whatever you want to. And so you have to be careful. We are a body that has to be checking on each other. Not in the sense of I'm looking for all the bad apples so we can get them out. We have to be watching for each other. We're careful about who's considered to be a member, which has its own issues, especially in our day and age. But we're also looking within each other to say, hey, how are you doing? Where are you going with this? What's happening in your life? That sounds a little awkward. Are you doing all right? And so we check. Especially when things happen, life goes on, things are challenging, and we start to get frustrated, and life, changes, your jobs changes, your kids grow up. All those things cause changes in us and how we view the world. And that's when we need each other, right? That's when we need each other to help us balance, to help us stay close. And then when we're looking at new members, what are we accepting as Southside Bible Church? As we went through 1 Corinthians, the big message in Corinthians was, to the Corinthians, Paul saying, what's more important than you? Is the gospel more important than you? Therefore, do you wear head coverings or not head coverings? It doesn't really matter. What does it say about the gospel as you go out into the world? Do you want to sue your brother? Well, you have the right to, but what does that tell the world about the gospel? As you're talking about marriage, what does that tell the world about the gospel? As you're talking about these gifts, about your wisdom, think about those things in terms of how it portrays the gospel to the world. What do you communicate when you do all those things? So in the same way, we're interested in members that say, what does the gospel, what does this body say to the world with who comes here, who we associate with, who we allow to stay? On one hand, you have sinners saved by grace in a community of sinners who all believe in grace, who all tolerate, who all love each other, who all pour into each other so that we can worship together. That speaks volumes to the world. But also when somebody decides that they're not going to follow the Bible and they're going to stand up and start spreading heresy, getting rid of that person also speaks to the world. Okay, those are kind of two extremes, but you kind of see where I'm going. Okay? So that's the picture that Bunyan has here. Watchful brings Christian to other people in the body to say, should this man be a member? Well, how do we decide? Well, let's ask him some questions. Let's talk a little bit. And this section, there's mainly dialogue. There's not as many actions, and it's actually all dialogue. But there's some really good doctrine in it. So Wyman Richardson said early Baptists were convinced that all prospective members should give evidence of their conversion. Without this, they forfeited not only their right to be a part of the church, but also the only factor that allows any of us to be members of the church, the new life given by and in Jesus Christ. In asking for evidence, these Baptists were following a practice that flows logically and naturally from a commitment to regenerate church membership. The need for evidence of conversion, in fact, makes perfect sense. If the membership of a local church consists only of regenerate, born-again people, then these people should be able to give evidence of the fact that they are, in fact, regenerate, as well as some sort of account of the time when they passed from death into life. So does that make sense? Because that's a big deal. Does it make sense that we are to have expectations for other people in the church? It's a terrible thing right now that nobody's allowed to have any expectations of anyone else because they'll call you intolerant. There are expectations. The only expectation now is that you accept me for anything I want to be. So, watchful the porter rang a bell, at the sound of which came out the door of a house a grave and beautiful damsel named Discretion, and asked why she was called. The porter answered, "This man is in a journey from the city of destruction to Mount Zion, but being weary and benighted, he asked me if he might lodge here tonight. So I told him I would call for thee, who, after discourse had with him, mayest do as seemeth thee good, even according to the law of the house." So stop there for a second. First of all, Discretion comes. She's viewed as a grave and beautiful damsel. Okay? Now, Bunyan likes to pick words for a reason. What does grave mean? What does it mean to be a grave? Serious. So does that mean she never smiles? Because Jesus was also considered to be grave. What does it mean to be grave?
It is sobriety about the situation. You assess things as they are. You don't just think everything's rose-colored.
Right? Yeah, so this is somebody who has weight to them. They view the situation as weighty. It's not that they don't have any joy, it's that they're also understanding the situation at hand. And they're focused. They're serious about it. Okay? So she's grave. Now, she's also a beautiful damsel. Now, and all the rest of the characters here are also going to be women. So why do you think that is? Because the church is predominantly women? You know that most of the Jewish converts were women. Everyone knows why, right?
The Bible in Proverbs, doesn't it refer to wisdom and discretion as she?
Yep. Generally, just wisdom is considered to be a female. But even more than that, a damsel brings up the idea of a virgin. Okay? So wisdom is considered to be a pure and chaste virgin. She is unsullied, she's pure, she's perfect, she's coming out, she's meek, those kind of pictures that come with this vision or this picture of a virgin, if that makes sense. So in the Proverbs, wisdom is considered to be a damsel. So Bunyan's using that same picture now as he goes and talks about all these different qualities that are going to come through. So the first one's discretion. Later on, we're going to see prudence, piety, and charity. Charity being the old word for love. Okay. So she comes out, she asks why. Now, notice what he says here. After you talk with him, you can do whatever you feel is good according to the law of the house. So what is that? What do you think? This is kind of a big deal. The law of the house are church rules, church doctrine, church practice. This is a time where the Anglican Church was the unifying quality of everything, right? And here Bunyan's saying that each house can have its own rules on what it considers to be a member. That was actually quite shocking at the time, because that would mean that every church could have a slightly different view of how things ought to be. Now, not all of them are biblically centered, not all of them are right, but Bunyan is saying that it's up to the church to decide what the rules of the house actually are. That was shocking at his time. In our day and age where we like independence of everything, that's not as big a deal. To them, it was. Okay? Then she asked him whence he was. She's talking to Christian. She asked him whence he was and whither he was going, and he told her. And she asked him how he got into the way, and he told her. Then he asked him what he had seen and met with in the way, and he told her. And last she asked his name. So he said it was Christian. And I have so much the more a desire to lodge here tonight, because by what I perceive, this place was built by the Lord of the hill for the relief and security of pilgrims. So she smiled, but the water stood in her eyes. And after a little pause, she said, I will call forth 2 or 3 more of the family. So she ran to the door and called out Prudence, Piety, and Charity, who after a little more discourse with him, had him into the family. And many of them, meeting him in the threshold of the house, said, Come in, thou blessed of the Lord. This house was built by the Lord of the hill on purpose to entertain such pilgrims in. Then he bowed his head and followed them into the house. So a couple of things we want to notice. Discretion talks to him. She asked him a series of questions. We actually saw these questions answered before. So she asked her the questions, and then he says, and then she says, and she smiled, even though she's grave, she smiles. She smiles, but the water stood in her eyes. What is that picturing? Mm-hmm. But the water stood in her eyes. It's a but, right?
I think so. She's not going to let her emotions go and just like love him and pull him in. There's still a few more steps to follow.
Yeah, do you see what discretion does? Discretion asks the right questions. She likes the answers, thus the smile. But is she willing to just throw open the doors and say, all right, we're all done here. Let's do this. I love you. You're the greatest thing since sliced bread. Come on in. See, do you see the balance that discretion has? That's what discretion is. That's the quality of discretion. Discretion is realizing the situation, accepting it for what it is, but also knowing what it isn't. Right? So discretion's talking to him. Stop short of saying, I love you. Come in. I give you full marks. She says, well, I love it, but let me check a little bit more. Let me do the little bit of extra homework. Let me call a few more people and let them take a look. Okay, that's the quality of discretion. So the water stood in her eyes. She's not overcome with her emotion, even though she likes what she sees. So she calls prudence, piety, and charity. We'll talk about those as we go. They come in the house. Then Christian enters in. Now, this is good. He bowed his head and followed them into the house. Now, what's that picturing? Why would he bow his head? It's not because there's a low door frame.
It's a sign of submission.
A submission and a reverence, right? There's a respect to this. He knows that he's entering into the house of God. He's not taking it for granted. It's not just a stop along the way. He's actually realizing and he's grateful for what he has discovered. He views a huge value to this body that he's entering into. And so he enters in, he bows his head in worship and in reverence for the body that he's now been welcomed into. How many people do we see that enter into a church and think it's actually that precious? Do we, when we visit other churches, because we're not always here, when we visit other churches, do we have the same reverence for that body even if we're only there for a weekend or something like that because we're visiting family or something, do we also realize that that body is just as precious as ours? And do we have a reverence for the body that Jesus bought, that God has created for our benefit? So, Christian enters in. He knows that this is holy ground. So when he was come in and sat down, they gave him something to drink and consented together that until supper was ready, some of them should have some particular discourse with Christian for the best improvement of time. And they appointed piety and prudence and charity to discourse with him. And thus they began. Now, as we go through this, it's important to understand, this is Bunyan's allegory. They're waiting for supper. They kind of have some downtime. Now, there's a lot of things you can do with downtime, especially in our day and age. It is possible to entertain yourself to hell in our day and age, right? So what do they say? Well, we got some downtime. Let's try to redeem this time, okay? Now, before we get too crazy about that and assume that every last minute has to be filled with only testimonies and godly speak, understand that Bunyan's talking about he's setting himself up right to be able to share a testimony. So don't get too carried away with that and feel like, well, Bunyan said we should always be talking spiritual things. I don't think that's what he's saying. He is saying, though, that we do need to take those times captive. What is the time used for? There are times where just getting together and watching the Super Bowl is appropriate. But is that the only things that you do? Do I only get together with my buddies and play video games? Do I only do X, Y, and Z for fun? Or are there also times where I get together and we talk seriously and we dig into each other's lives? Okay? So that the redeeming of time, right? Thinking about the spiritual things, putting them first, that's important. We have to redeem that time when we have those opportunities. All right, so piety is going to come first. Now, what is piety? Not a word we use typically, but what is it? Something like that?
Righteousness, or seeking after righteousness.
Okay, seeking after righteousness. Piety was the practice of worship. Okay, so you were considered to be pious. You were worshipful. Does that make sense? So one of Bunyan's books was the practice of piety. And now that seems silly, but one of the issues that they had, especially after Luther and Calvin, there was a huge influx of doctrine. And all of a sudden, every church had its doctrinal statement. And we had all the Baptist confessions and this confession and that confession. Everybody else was arguing about these little points of doctrine to the point where you could be 99% in agreement, but that 1% would be the thing that would divide you. Okay, so what happened was there was the Puritan movement, then there was the pietistic movement that was a reaction to the Puritan movement. And what that was the idea that we're becoming so doctrine that we're forgetting the heart. Okay? And of course, it's both, right? So what was happening, though, was there was a rising tide of the pietists that said, we don't want any doctrine, we just want heart. And they had some good stuff in there, because actually that was one of the things that was important that was being lost at the time. And so Bunyan would read the practice of piety, and he would also read the doctrine, and he was very good at merging the two. But piety, in our case, is this damsel comes in, and she's interested in, where's your heart? Where's your heart? What really makes you tick? What do you care about? What are the things that are precious to you? This is what piety is going to come through, which is interesting because we talk about that. Our last person is going to be charity or love. So you would think she'd ask the same questions, but love is actually going to be the hardest of the characters to talk to Christian. Okay, so let's talk about piety. Piety says, "Come, good Christian, since we have been so loving to you, to receive you into our house this night, let us, if perhaps we may better ourselves thereby, talk with you of all things that have happened to you in your pilgrimage." All right, so let's hear about your testimony. Christian says, "With a very good will, I am glad that you are so well disposed." Piety says, "What moved you at first to betake yourself to a pilgrim's life?" Christian says, "I was driven out of my native country by a dreadful sound that was in mine ears, to wit, the unavoidable destruction did attend me if I abode in that country place where I was. But how did it happen that you came out of your country this way?" So notice we're not going to go through all the details because we've read the book. We kind of know everything so far. So Christian's going to describe a lot of what we've already read. What we want to do is look at some of the differences, but also look at the line of questioning. How does piety kind of continue through? How does prudence form her questions based on what she just learned? That's what we're really going to study a little bit here. So she says, what made you become a Christian? Christian says, well, I was driven out because there was unavoidable destruction. I was afraid that I was going to go to hell if I stayed where I was at. Now that seems like that's a pretty good answer. How many of us would just say, okay, I'm with you. Instead, piety continues to ask the questions. But how did it happen to you that you came out of your country this way? Tell me what that conviction looked like. Christian says, it was as God would have it. For when I was under the fears of destruction, I did not know whither to go. But by chance, I love that, as God would have it and by chance. Is it really only by chance? It may look like chance to us, but as God would have it, okay, changes all the chances in the world.
We just can't link it with something that makes sense.
Yeah, we don't link it until it's far after the course we realize, oh, whoa.
We may never.
Yeah. From Christian's point of view, it just happened, right? But when we look back, we know that there is no chance with God. God does not roll dice with the universe. But by chance there came a man, even to me, as I was trembling and weeping. Notice his actions. He was trembling and weeping, whose name is Evangelist, and he directed me to the wicket gate, which else I should never have found, and so set me into the way that hath led me directly to this house. So notice that the question here, what moved you to take yourself to the Pilgrim's life? Well, I was afraid of hell. Okay? And so Christian piety is not so much interested in, well, Christian, do you know that you're a sinner? What is it that really made you move? What is it that really set you on the way? Are you aware of it, or are you just running from something? Okay, so that's your first line of questioning. And Christian says, well, I was weeping and trembling. I didn't know what to do. And then I met this guy, Evangelist, who told me about the wicket gate. And so piety says, well, did you not come by the house of interpreter? What have you learned so far? Yes, and did see such things there, the remembrance of which will stick by me as long as I live. Remember, the house of the interpreter was the man that tried to get across the bridge. There was the flame that wouldn't go out, if you guys remember some of those pictures. That was the house of the interpreter. Especially three things, to wit, how Christ, in despite of Satan, maintains his work of grace in the heart, how the man had sinned himself quite out of hopes of God's mercy, and also the dream of him that thought in his sleep the day of judgment was come. Okay? Why did you hear him tell his dream? Yes, and a dreadful one it was. I thought it made my heart ache as he was telling me of it, but yet I am glad I heard it. Okay, so kind of stop right there real quick. Just as an aside, you can see the three things that Christian pulls out of this. Okay, and remember, Christian is a picture of Bunyan. So what was Bunyan's pet fears in life? He took comfort in the fact that Christ, despite Satan's attempts, maintains the work of grace in his heart. But there's two things that he feared most. One, the man who had sinned himself out of God's mercy, and second, the dream of him who in his sleep thought that he had missed the rapture. So what are the two things that Bunyan was most fearful of, and that many of us could probably identify with?
Our conversion is not true.
And then we are still stuck in our sins. And when are we going to find that out?
Yeah.
When it's too late. Right? That was his fear. And you're going to see it as we finish this book, Lord willing, guess what his last screw up is going to be? This fear of failure at the very end. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to make it. On the threshold, he's saying, I'm not going to make it. Right? And that was his fear. So you're seeing this character issue with Christian that I think Bunyan probably portrays from himself, that's going to continue, and we're going to keep watching this. How do you deal with a real person that deals with these kind of issues? Well, he struggles with depression. He struggles with doubt. He struggles not doubting who God is, doubting who he is, doubting his ability to continue. So you're going to see this continue throughout the book. Bunyan's going to keep evolving this, especially in the second half of the book. And so we'll watch this, and hopefully we can identify with him and be able to gain some lessons from it. Was that all you saw in the house of the interpreter? No, he took me and he had me to where he showed me a stately palace, and how the people were clad in gold, how there were venturous men came out and cut his way through the armed men that stood in the door to keep him out, and how he was bid to come in and win eternal glory. Methought those things did ravish my heart. I would have stayed at that good man's house a 12-month, but I knew that I had to go further. So remember, it's sort of true at the end there, that last statement. He said, I would have stayed there for a year, a 12-month. 12-month kind of sounds cooler than a year, but I would have stayed there for a year if I could have. I would have stayed there for longer and learned, but I had to go further. Now that's important, because Christian was the one who said, I got to get going. And it was the interpreter that said, hold on, one more lesson. And then Christian said, I got to keep going. I got to keep going. Okay? So there's an issue that we're seeing in Christian, that he thinks that he would like to stay, but he keeps saying, I got to keep going. So there's an impatience in Christian. There's this idea that he's on his own timetable. You want to know what destroys your assurance? When you start deciding what you think is the best course of action, instead of letting God lead you according to the best course of action. Because once you start taking your own path, once you start making your own decisions, once you decide that your wisdom leads you down your path, guess what you will most likely leave? God's path. And guess what's going to happen to Christian eventually in this book, right? What makes perfect sense in his mind will be some of his worst decisions.
Seems like he's also so anxious to get to the end that he's not having an appreciation for the process.
Right. Exactly. Where does God take me? What has he given to me? Let me enjoy what God's given to me for the season he's given to me, instead of being so worried about getting to the next step that I got to leave it as fast as I possibly can. Because that really is, it's a source of pride. It really is my judgment telling me when God's favor is over, if you will. And that's not good. That's not good. All right. So you can see that. We'll keep developing that as we keep going. Now, the key statement here, and this is what piety is looking for, are these kind of statements. Methought those things did ravish my heart. What does that mean? As he looked at these lessons, and remember, the house of the interpreter is the Holy Spirit teaching Christian different lessons from the Bible. That's what we talked about with the house of the interpreter. It's basically, what does a new believer learn immediately? What are those things that God presses upon the heart of a new believer right away? Okay? Now, his reaction is what we're interested in. And that's what piety is interested in. That's interesting that you learn that, but what did it do to you? What does it do to your character? What does it do to your heart? And this is what Christian says. It did ravish my heart. What does that mean? It means that it took him away. It captured his heart. It drove him. I loved it. It was so important to me. You can meet with a number of professing Christians that have no affection for the things that they're learning. It doesn't do anything to them other than feed their minds. They're interesting people to talk to until you realize that they don't really care about what they're saying. They're just telling you things because they care about the knowledge. Does the lessons that God is impressing upon you, do the things that you're learning, does your testimony get you fired up? As you talk about what God's done in your life, as you're talking about the lessons that you've learned, could you go on and on and on? Not because you're talkative, but because God's just done so much. And there is important things that you love to talk about. Does the work that he does in your heart and the things that he presses upon you, are they precious? Or are they just facts? Do you see the difference? And that's what we're looking for. This is what piety is looking for. Remember, piety is the idea of worship. And here he's talking about, I was doing this and it just ravished my heart. Notice how she didn't have to convince, kind of get Christian to admit it, kind of prod him. Well, I mean, is that important to you? Oh yeah, that's important to me. Notice that Christian, just as he's talking, says, it ravished my heart. I couldn't get over it. It was so important. It just comes out with the way he's speaking. She's not prodding him to explain his affections. It becomes obvious. Does that make sense? We've been talking a lot about dating with my kids because they're just kind of just at that age. And so we do talk about this idea that when you meet the right person, there isn't like a lot of convincing. It just becomes natural to want to do things with that person. There's an affection. There's a natural bent that just says, well, that'll be fun to do. I can't wait to do it with Laura. I can't wait to tell her about this. And she's just the first person that I think about when I picture how am I going to do this? There's just two people always involved in that imaginative dream or that daydream, because I can't imagine not doing it without her. I can't imagine doing it without her. Never mind. So you see what I'm saying? So there's just kind of a natural affection. It just kind of, it flows, not because I have to sit there and think, oh, I'd like to do that. Let's see, who would I do that? Laura would be a great person, right? I don't have to sit there and kind of add her on to what I'm already thinking. It just kind of flows. And that's the same idea here, is that when you're talking about the Lord and the things of the Lord, do you just naturally get fired up? Do you just naturally have that affection that flows out? Okay? Now Piety says this, and what saw you else in the way? Krishna said, saw why I went a little bit further, and I saw one, as I thought in my mind, hang bleeding upon the tree, and the very sight of him made my burden fall off my back, for I groaned under a very heavy burden, and then it fell down off of me. It was a strange thing to me, for I never saw such a thing before. Yea, and while I stood looking up, for then I could not forbear looking, 3 shining ones came to me, one of them testified of my sins. Now stop right there for a second. When we saw that scene, when Bunyan wrote the scene initially, he just said, there was a cross at the top of a hill. Christian looked and looked until the tears fell from his face, and then his burden fell off his back and it rolled into the sepulcher. That was the entire description. Remember, we actually kind of said that was kind of interesting, that, number one, he gets the cross 10% of the book, so the last 90% of the book is him after the cross. And second, it's basically one paragraph of his conversion, right? But notice what's happening now. Before, he just looked at a cross and he started to cry. But notice what he says here. I thought in my mind, I saw one hang bleeding upon the tree, and the very sight of him made my burden fall off my back. Well, hold on. Now he saw something else. Now he says that as he looked at this cross, what he actually saw was one bleeding on the tree. So what is Bunyan saying? Is he just forget that detail and didn't, they didn't have a word processor, so instead of rewriting the manuscript, he decided just to fill in the detail now? Or is there something else? In the interest of time, we're not going to discuss it. Here's the idea. Bunyan realizes that every believer is maturing, right? So when he saw the cross, he knew that Jesus died for him and that he believed it and his burden fell off. But guess what's happening as he grows?
Becomes a lot more real.
Becomes more real. He understands more of the, if you will, the mechanics of how it works. He starts to understand what it means for God to be righteous, what it means for Jesus to be righteous, for what it means for me to believe and have that righteousness and credit to me. Before, it was enough, just like the thief on the cross saying, I believe in you, today you'll be with me in paradise. Did that thief have excellent doctrine? Depends on how you want to define it. Did he know who Jesus was? Yep. And that's all he believed in. And that's all he needed. Right? But as you grow, you're starting to learn more about who Jesus is. Okay? And that's what's happening here, is that Christian's understanding more. And so now as he talks about his testimony, it's getting enriched as he reflects back on what God was teaching him now and how that affects past things that God has done. So he's learning. Okay? He's not rewriting history. He's adding the details that he didn't understand before. Okay? So it was a strange thing for me, so I never saw that thing before. Now 3 shining ones came to me. Now remember the 3 shining ones? Mark on the head, a robe, and a scroll. Okay? One of them 3 shining ones came to me. One of them testified that my sins were forgiven me. Another stripped me of my rags and gave me this broidered coat which you see. And the third set a mark on my forehead and gave me this sealed roll, the which he plucked it out of his bosom. Now, notice this is important too. Before it was just a robe. This beautiful, new, unused, perfect white robe. Now we see one other detail added to it. It was broidered. Okay? Now, first of all, what is embroidery? You guys know what that is?
Fancy sewing.
Fancy sewing. But usually, what does it look like?
An ornate pattern.
Right. Very ornate. So it's got cool little filigree and all kinds of stuff. And this time it would have had like gold thread and different color thread. Now, why is this a big deal? Because I can buy towels with embroidery anymore. Now, why was it a big deal for him?
They didn't have machines to do it back then.
Right. So who were the only ones that got to have embroidered clothing? Yeah. Kings, dukes, earls, the guys that you never were going to be, right? And yet here's Bunyan saying that Christian's walking around, and now as he looks at his robe a little closer, what is he finding out? It's not just a nice, beautiful, perfect white robe. It's a perfect white robe that's embroidered. So what does that detail now set off? If the only people that got embroidered clothing were kings, and Bunyan, or Christian, now has this robe that's embroidered.
Child of the king.
Exactly. You see what else he's learned? It's not that Jesus just forgave my sins. Now, I am also an heir in a royal family. Same robe, same picture. It hasn't lost its beauty and its perfection and its whiteness that comes from the righteousness of Christ. But now he's also realizing the additional thing. You are not just saved by grace. You are adopted into the family. You are fundamentally different. See how this growth of learning? This is what piety wants to see in Christian. Do I see this? Do we see this as we talk to people here? Can we give testimony as we talk to other people about their growth in grace? Do I see it in my kids? Do I see it in the people that we meet with? Am I seeking to find out if they're growing in grace? That's the other question. That's what piety is doing. Tell me about where you're at. Hey man, what's going on with you? Let's just sit over coffee and let's chat a little about what God's teaching you. Well, he's just going to take me through work. Well, that's cool. Everybody's got to work. What kind of things are happening at work? What kind of things are you learning? What kind of things is God teaching you through mundane work, through laundry and taking care of kids and changing diapers and all those kind of things that are never any fun? What is God teaching you through those things? Are we seeking those out, and do we hear the testimony and recognize a heart that's growing in grace? Does that make sense? So that's what piety is looking for. Let's see. But you saw more than this. The things I've told you are the best, yet some other matters. Namely, I saw 3 men, simple sloth and presumption, lie asleep a little out of the way as I came with irons upon their heels. Formality and hypocrisy. We talked about those guys. They came over the wall, so they pretended to Zion, but they were quickly lost. But above all, I found it hard work to get up this hill, and it's hard to come by the lion's mouth. And truly, if it had not been for the good man, the porter that stands at the gate, I do not know, but that after all I might have gone back again. But now I thank God that I am here. So we're going to move on, but there's a few more things that are kind of interesting in there if you look and see as he learns. Okay. The other thing that's important now, he just says this. Above all, I found it hard work to go up this hill and come by the lion's mouth. So all the details that he gives, and what does he leave out? It's one major plot element that he doesn't summarize in his little story there to piety. Huh?
The lions are bound.
Nope. What happened on the hill? Oops. I didn't want to tell you about my big screw up. Okay, let's move on. Then prudence thought good at. So now prudence comes in. Now what's prudence? That's a word we never use. What does it mean to be a prude?
Just think of somebody who's very proper, but that's a good definition.
Proper, yeah.
Reliable. Is that? Yes, no, maybe.
Reliable, good.
Yeah.
Prudence has a careful quality. How do you think through a situation? It's very similar to discretion, prudence and discretion. Prudence is this idea that that's why it was to be a prude was always, my picture of it comes up from these old movies, the Beaver, Leave It to Beaver. I know I watched too much TV growing up, but that's where are you a prude? Was this idea? Are you not willing to kind of let it all hang out? Are you not willing to go have some fun, usually in the wrong context? And so you were a prude, right? You wouldn't.
You're also a rule follower.
Yeah, exactly. You were a rule follower, right? That's not what we're talking about here, but that's the negative essence of what we're talking about. Prudence is this idea that I do examine a situation, and I am careful in my thoughts and my actions. I take them captive. I'm measured in my response. I care about how I act. That's prudence. Okay. So prudence says this. Do you think sometimes of the country from whence you came? Now that's an interesting question. Do you ever think about your life before you were saved? That's what she's asking. Christian says, yes, but with much shame and detestation. Okay, now remember, these are all leading questions. She's not just asking because I don't know, it's my turn to ask a question. How about this? Right? She's asking. She's trying to find out about Christian. She's trying to find out what makes him tick. Do you think about your life before you were saved? And she's expecting an answer. What would you expect of an answer? What would you expect of an answer if you were to ask somebody this question? Do you ever think about what it was like before you were saved? What you were like before you were saved?
I guess you would kind of expect that they would say, oh, no way, I've moved forward. I haven't.
True. Yeah, that's one possible, right? No, what's old, Paul said, what's old is past, what's new is what we're going to step forward to, so I run the race. Is that a good way of doing things? No. Who you are is who you are. And what happened before you were saved is important. It doesn't reveal who you will be, but it certainly is not something you disregard. Why? Because God was the same God before you were saved as He is after. So when we look and see what I was like before, I have to reflect on that in light of who God is. That's important. You can't live there, but it's important to consider it. Now, more than that, what else are we looking at? How much fun it was to go to those parties. I kind of really miss that. I mean, the way that, we used to go to get some slosh. Man, we had some great times, didn't we? The way we were drunk and stupor all the time, running around campus. Wasn't that great? If that's the way it comes out, but now I'm past that, I'm a Christian now, so we can't do that kind of stuff. Would that raise a red flag to any of you if that was a response? Because in essence, what they said is, I can't do that anymore. I don't do that anymore. Well, that's good. But what's the problem?
Sounds like they wish they could.
Yeah. They sound like they wish they could. There's still a value to that lifestyle that they still see. They just say that I can't do it anymore.
They don't see the depravity.
Right. They don't see it.
It's like there's the perspective is somehow that was okay
Exactly.
or good somehow.
Right. They don't see it as depraved. They don't see what the difference was in that lifestyle compared to God. And we look at Ephesians 2, who were you? You were at enmity with God. That lifestyle puts you at enmity. You are an enemy of God. Do you recognize that? Do you recognize who you were and what God saved you out of? Right? So that's what she's trying to get to. Do you understand who you are, who you were, what's changed to make that happen? Are you careful with how you run your life, knowing that that's what you were doing before versus how? Do you even recognize a difference?
It says we were dead in our transgressions. I think a lot of times we don't see ourselves as being spiritually dead.
A lot of times we don't. Yeah, a lot of times we struggle with the idea that I was mostly dead, right? But mostly dead is slightly alive, right? To claim theology from the Princess Bride. But that's true. And to really realize just how far away from grace you really are, it takes concentration. It also takes a certain amount of bravery. I don't want to admit that. I really don't. Okay? We are really running short on time, so we're going to get going through this pretty quickly. Yes, but with much shame and detestation. Truly, if I had been mindful of that country from whence I came out, I might have had opportunity to have returned. But now I desire a better country, that is, a heavenly country. And that's from Hebrews, where they realize what he's left and where he's going. So Prudence says, do you not bear away with you some of the things that when you were conversant withal? Do you not still have some of these attending sins from before? Christian says, yes, but greatly against my will. Now this is important. Christian says, I'm not sinless. Who were you before? Well, I was like this. Well, do you still struggle with some of those things? To be honest with you, yeah, I do. And I don't like it. I hate the fact that I still struggle with some of those same sins. I struggled with lust before, and guess what I struggle with now? Well, I struggle with lust. Okay, so that's important to recognize, because what does 1 John tell us? If you say you're without sin, you're a liar and the truth is not in you. So to say that you're without sin is one thing. Now, the other thing that Prudence is driving at is, do you recognize it? And then what's the other part? Are you fighting it? Right? Yes, I want to make sure that you actually think that you're a sinner and realize that you're still struggling with some of the same sins, but I also want to see that you're fighting it. So the prudence is two sides of the same coin. Okay? Yes, but greatly against my will, especially my inward and carnal cogitations, with which all my countrymen, as well as myself, were delighted. I love these things, these carnal sinful thoughts. But now all those things are my grief. And might I but choose mine own things, I would choose never to think of those things more. But when I would be doing that of which is best, and that which is worst is with me. So I'm struggling with this because I want to do what's right, but I struggle because I know that I don't. Okay, that's the summary. Prudence says, do you not find sometimes as if those things were vanquished, which at other times are your perplexity? Yes, but that is but seldom. But they are to me golden hours in which such things happen to me. So Prudence says, but don't you find victory over this? Are there times where you're not struggling? If your life is a consistent struggle, there's a problem, because you have the Holy Spirit within you. And so there's got to be some amount of victory to your life. If you are transformed, if your heart is no longer what it was, then the things of holiness are beautiful to you. The desire for holiness is growing, and you should be, Prudence, restraining yourself from things that you know are problems. If you're consistently struggling, the question may be, why are you putting yourself in that position? Is there no self-control in your life to avoid those sins? And so now all you are is really recognizing sin, not necessarily fighting sin. Does that make sense? So Prudence is asking the question here, do you have times of peace? Do you have times of victory? Christians should have times of victory. He says, seldom. There are times, not always, but I do say I know I struggle with sin, but there are times where I know that I have victory over that. I don't struggle with it. Pride, anger, whatever it is. There are times when I'm peaceful. There are times when I don't have impure thoughts. There's times when I don't struggle with, when I'm at peace with both in my mind and my heart, and people don't get on my nerves. If you struggle with anger. Can you remember by what means you find your annoyances at times that they're vanquished? What are the occasions? What brings those times of peace about? And Christian says, when I think I saw the cross, when I look to my broidered coat, that will do it. Also, when I look to the roll that I carry in my bosom, that will do it. And when my thoughts wax warm about whither I am going, that will do it. So what are the things that really put Christian at ease and give him victory? When he looks to the cross, when he thinks about being an heir of Christ, when I look at my assurance of what Christ has done, and when I think about heaven. When I put my mind in heaven with God, thinking about what he's done, guess what that does to my sins? Guess what that does to my heart? Okay? And what is it that makes you so desirous to go to Mount Zion? Christian says, why, there I hope to see him alive that did hang dead on the cross. And there I hope to be rid of all those things that do this day are in me, an annoyance to me. There they say there is no death, and there I shall dwell with such company as I like best. For to tell you the truth, I love him, because I was by him eased of my burden, and I am weary of my inward sickness. I would fain be there. I shall die no more, and with a company that shall continually cry, holy, holy, holy. So this is interesting. Why do you want to go to heaven? Now, if you ask anyone, they will say, I want to go to heaven when I die. But here's the difference. Look at Christian's answer. Why do you want to go to heaven? I want to see him who died on the cross. I want to be rid of my sinfulness. And I want to worship with all the other people that think the same thing. Those are the people that I desire. Is that why you want to go to heaven? Is that why we want to go to heaven? Is it just my get out of jail free card? Is it my fire insurance? Do I hope to have wings and sit on clouds and watch my kids and my grandkids and my great-grandkids grow up? Do I think it's going to be a gigantic golf course in heaven? All those kind of things come up. The song we used to sing when I was in college, In My Father's House, by Audio Adrenaline. And when we go there, we can play football, and everybody used to yell their favorite sport, and we got really charged up. It was fun. It was such a bad doctrine. It was such a bad view of heaven. It was a great song without the words, right? But the problem was, because what is it that I'm going to heaven for? It's not so I can have more of this world on a cloud. I want to go to heaven so I can see Jesus. I want to go to heaven so I can worship purely. I want to go and hang out with everyone else, and we all enjoy God's throne together. Is that why I go to heaven? Is that why I desire to go to heaven? If somebody were to ask me that, and would that be my testimony? Not, is that the right answer? Yes, of course it's the right answer. Is that my answer? That's the big question. Okay? All right, charity. I told you charity is the hardest. She's going to nail him. Ready? Then said Charity to Christian, have you a family? Are you a married man? I have a wife and 4 small children. Now, you know this is not going well when she starts digging into the details, right? Well, why didn't you bring them along? Ooh, okay. Then Christian wept and said, oh, how willingly would I have done it. But they are all of them utterly averse to my going on pilgrimage. Now, this is important, okay? So charity is another word for love. Love comes over to Christian and says, do you have a family? Yeah. Where are they? Where are they? Now, that line of questioning is pointed because she's digging into the details. And she's going to hit Christian where she knows that he's likely sensitive, right? So what are the reactions that Christian could have?
To listen or to reject it.
How would you reject it?
It doesn't. My family is rejected my pilgrimage, so I've left them behind because I'm all sold out for the kingdom. Good. So they could. Okay. And what is he doing when he says that kind of stuff? I left them behind because I'm sold out for the kingdom. It's kind of like when the Pharisees said that anything that you say to your parents, anything you have for me is to the kingdom, so you don't have to worry about them anymore. So now you replace your duty to them with a pretended duty to God.
Exactly. So there could be this defensive, I'm going to pretend that I'm being pious. I'm going to pretend that, and by what you're really doing is you're revealing a lack of love for what God's really done in you. Okay? So she's putting him on the defense. She's asking questions that offer the opportunity for him to go on the defensive. He could defend himself. It's not my fault. Okay? They didn't want to come. Stop badgering me about it. I gave them everything and they didn't do it. Or, well, you know what? The kingdom's too important. I'm going to leave them behind. All these things that he could do, right? And she's trying to dig in. How will he react when it becomes a personal item of things that he cares about that he would like to have go one way? We'd all like to see it go one way. How will he react? So that's her questioning. Why aren't they here? Notice Christian starts to weep. I would love to have done it, but they didn't want to come. And Charity says, but you should have talked to them and have endeavored to show them the danger of what's being behind. And Christian says, so I did. I told them also what God had shown me of the destruction of our city. But I seemed to them as one that mocked, and they believed me not. So didn't you share with them? I did share with them. So then love would have said, oh, okay, that's cool. You share with them. Nope. And did you pray to God that he would bless your counsel to them? Yeah, okay, you share with them. But did you pray about it? I prayed about it, yes, and that with much affection. For you must think that my wife and poor children were very dear to me. But did you tell them of your sorrow and fear of destruction? For I suppose that destruction was visible enough. Was it obvious? Did you pour out your heart to them? Notice how love is just kind of digging in. She will not let him get away with the surface answer. She's not satisfied with the correct answer. She's digging down to see if he's consistent in the way that he continues to describe his love for these people. Because what happens? Why watch all the courtroom dramas. What do? They start getting a lot of questions, and they just keep going and going and going, and they get more and more pointed. What are they trying to get the witness to do?
Say what's really on their heart.
Get through all the stuff that they know they should say and see if I can get them so charged up that they finally break and give me, the climax of the story, which always breaks it, right? That's the idea. Love keeps pushing Christian and keeps hitting the same sensitive hot button to see if his story changes. She wants to know whether this is the true answer or just the right answer. And that's what she's going for. She really wants to see where his heart truly is. So, did you not tell them of your own sorrow? Yes, over and over and over. They might also see my fears in my countenance, in my tears, and also in the trembling under the apprehension of judgment that did hang over our heads. But all was not sufficient to prevail with them to come with me. So notice all the things that Christian did. He prays for them. He shares with them. They did see the fears. They saw it. I told them about it. They could see it hanging over me. I proved it to them. I gave them a whole bunch of descriptions, and yet that still wasn't enough. See how Christian has poured out his heart. And notice there's no defensiveness in the way that Christian responds to Charity. He's already thought this through. What Charity is asking him is not foreign to him. He knows the answer. But what could they say for themselves, and why they came not? Why my wife was afraid of losing this world, and my children were given to foolish delights of youth. So what by one thing and what by another they left me to wander in this manner alone. But did you not, with your vain life, damp all that you used by way of persuasion to bring them away with you? Indeed, I cannot commend my life, for I am conscious of many things of my failings therein. I know also that a man by his conversation may soon overthrow what by argument or persuasion he doth labor to fasten upon the good. So basically he says, I know my life wasn't great, but yet this I can say, I was very wary of giving them occasion by any unseemly action to make them averse to going on pilgrimage. Even before he was saved, he was already considering his words and his ways to try to convince his family that they need to be thinking about the same thing. Even before you, so that proves a lot. Yea, for this very thing they would tell me that I was too precise, and I denied myself of things for their sakes in which they saw no evil. Nay, I think I may say that if what they say in me did hinder them, it was my great tenderness in sinning against God, or of doing any wrong to my neighbor. Charity says, indeed, Cain hated his brother because his own works were evil and his brother's righteous. And if thy wife and children have been offended by thee for this, they thereby show themselves to be implacable to good, and thou hast delivered thy soul from their blood. So finally, Charity lets him off the hook with, okay, you're right. It sounds like you poured out your heart, and they've made a decision. They must live by their decision. Okay? If they don't like righteousness, but you have done what you will do. In part 2 of Pilgrim's Progress, Christian's testimony causes Christian and his wife to actually leave the sea of destruction, and they continue along, and as they go through, they actually see all the things that Christian has done, and that encourages them to continue on their journey. So there's a happy ending to that piece. But notice that Charity is the hardest one. Just keeps pushing and pushing. Did you pour out your heart? Did you speak? Did your life commend it as well as it could? Did you consider them before yourself? Were you poured out for their sake? Did you pour yourself out for their sake? And that's what she wants to know. Were you selfless in what God has given you? Did you lose everything for the kingdom? Not just leave it all behind. Did you lose everything for the kingdom? Okay?